Hey there, survivors. Thanks for tuning in to tonight's episode. If you're new here, please consider subscribing. It really helps me keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now let's get started. I woke up to shouting outside my window. At first, I thought it was one of the neighbors arguing again, the kind of muffled shouting you can half hear through closed curtains. But then, there was another sound. Something like a door splintering, and a scream that was nothing like the usual village squabbles. It cut straight through the night like a knife. I pulled the blanket off and moved to the window, careful not to wake Ben. He was still curled up on his mattress on the floor, breathing quietly. From the second-floor window I could see the outline of our neighbor's house across the lane, its security light flashing on and off. Two figures were struggling in the doorway. I blinked, thinking maybe I was imagining it, but then the taller figure lunged forward with a speed that didn't look right. It tackled the other one to the ground, and the scream started again. I stepped back from the glass, unsure of what I was even watching. Then the front door downstairs opened fast, and Dad's voice came up the stairwell. "James, get your brother, now, quietly." There was something in his tone I had never heard before. Not once in 17 years. Dad was a sailor, a man who worked the trawlers even in storms that bent the masts. I had seen him pull a man half drowned out of the sea, bleeding from a crushed hand, and he hadn't flinched, but his voice now was clipped and hard in a way that made me grab Ben by the shoulder immediately. Ben woke up, groggy and confused. "What is it?" "Shh," I whispered, pressing a finger to my lips. "We have to go. Get your shoes." Downstairs, Mum was already in her wheelchair near the kitchen, her hands gripping the armrests like she was holding herself in place. Dad had thrown his old duffel on the table and was shoving things into it without even checking. I saw tins from the cupboard, the first aid kit, bottles of water. His face was pale, but he moved with purpose. "James," he said, looking up at me. "Shoes, coat, we're leaving now." I hesitated. "What's happening?" He didn't answer. He zipped the bag and turned to Mum. "We're going out the back. Stay low. Don't make noise." Through the back door window, I saw movement in the lane again. The security light from the neighbor's house was still flashing, and now there were four figures in the yard. Their shapes jerked unnaturally, like their joints didn't work properly anymore. I swallowed hard. "Dad, are those—" "Don't look," he cut in sharply. "Just stay behind me." We moved into the cold night. The air smelled of sea salt and wood smoke, the familiar scent of our village. But there was something else now, something rotten on the wind. The grass was wet under my trainers as I pushed Mum's wheelchair through the narrow garden gate. Ben stayed close, clutching the straps of his rucksack like he was afraid to let go. Dad led us through the hedge at the back of the property and into the field beyond. He didn't turn on a torch, didn't say a word. The only sounds were the crunch of the grass and the faint wails from the village behind us. We crossed one field, then another. The stone walls between them slowed us down, and Dad had to lift Mum's chair each time, grunting softly. She bit her lip but didn't complain. Her legs were twisted from the accident years ago, and she couldn't walk more than a few steps even with help. Tonight she didn't ask questions. She just clung to the arms of the chair and kept her head low. Ben stumbled once and nearly fell, catching himself on the edge of a wall. Dad turned and grabbed him by the jacket, holding him steady. "Eyes forward, lad. We're close to the woods." I glanced back once, against Dad's orders. In the distance, I could see the glow of fires near the village. It was faint, just a flicker over the roofs, but it was enough to make my stomach twist. I could still hear the screams. Some were human. Some, I didn't know. We reached the edge of the woods just as the moon disappeared behind a cloud. Dad knelt and checked the duffel, pulling out a length of rope and an old hammer he must have grabbed from the shed. "Stay close to me. If you hear anything, don't shout. Just grab my arm." The woods were worse than the fields. Every branch overhead creaked like something was following us, and the path was slick with mud. My hands ached from gripping the wheelchair handles so tightly, trying to stop it sliding off the trail. Ben walked ahead of me, glancing back every few steps, At one point, we all froze. There was a noise to our left, something moving through the undergrowth. It wasn't the wind. Dad raised a hand, telling us not to move. The noise came closer, and I could see the bushes shifting in the moonlight. For a second, I thought it was one of those things from the village. But then, a fox darted across the path, vanishing into the shadows. Dad let out a breath and gestured for us to keep going. By the time we reached the stream on the far side of the woods, my legs were shaking from the effort of pushing the chair. The stream was narrow, but the bridge had collapsed years ago, and the only way across was a series of slick stones. Dad took off his coat and wrapped it around Mum's shoulders. "James, you're going first with your brother. Once you're across, help me get the chair." I wanted to protest, but one look at his face stopped me. I took Ben's hand and led him across the stones. The water was cold, soaking into my trainers, and the rocks shifted under my feet. But we made it to the other side without falling. I turned just in time to see Dad lift Mum out of her chair, cradling her like she weighed nothing. He stepped carefully, his boots barely making a sound. He handed her to me when he reached the far bank, then went back for the chair. That was when the first moan echoed through the trees. It was faint, almost distant, but it made every hair on my arm stand on end. Dad froze on the stones, glancing over his shoulder into the woods. The sound came again, louder this time, and I realized it wasn't just one voice. "They followed us," Ben whispered. "Quiet," Dad snapped, shoving the chair onto the bank. "Move, now." We didn't argue. We pushed deeper into the fields beyond the woods, the moans behind us growing more frantic. I kept expecting a hand to grab me from the dark, but we didn't look back. After what felt like forever, we reached a narrow lane. Dad stopped to catch his breath, scanning the horizon. I could see the faint glimmer of water beyond the hedges, the estuary that led to the harbor. "We'll cut through the old orchard," Dad said. "It's quicker." The orchard was a mess of dead trees and rotting apples, the ground slick and uneven. I could hear the infected behind us now, no longer distant. Their footsteps were heavy, uncoordinated, but relentless. Dad pulled the hammer from the bag and handed it to me. "If one of them grabs you, swing hard. Don't stop. Understand?" I nodded, gripping the handle until my knuckles hurt. We had almost cleared the orchard when something burst from the bushes ahead. It wasn't like the ones I'd seen in the village. This one was faster, its limbs jerking like it had no control over them. It crashed into Ben before I could react, knocking him to the ground. Ben cried out as the creature pinned him to the earth, its clawing hands tearing at his jacket as if it was trying to rip him apart. The sound it made was worse than the others, a broken rasp, wet and uneven, like air escaping through ruined lungs. Its head jerked toward Ben's throat, jaws opening unnaturally wide, and I swung the hammer before I could think about what I was doing. The blow landed on the side of its skull with a sickening crack that I felt all the way up my arm. It staggered sideways, but it didn't fall. Dad was already there, dragging the thing off my brother and throwing it into the trunk of a gnarled apple tree. The impact split the bark, but the creature thrashed forward again, faster than I expected. Dad's hammering fist slammed into it once, twice, then he grabbed its hair and drove its head into the tree with a force that shook the branches. There was a sound like dry wood splitting, and it went limp, sliding to the ground in a heap. For a moment, the only sound was Ben's panicked breathing. He scrambled back, his face pale and streaked with dirt, and I knelt beside him, checking him over. His jacket was torn across the shoulder where the thing had grabbed him, but his skin underneath was unbroken. Dad crouched too, his broad hands shaking as he checked Ben's neck, arms and chest, as though he was convinced there had to be some hidden wound. Finally he nodded. "He's fine," he said, but his voice was a rasp. "We need to move, now." The orchard felt like it was closing in on us. Every creak of the wind through the trees sounded like footsteps. I helped Ben up, and we pushed forward through the last row of skeletal trunks. I kept glancing back at the body, half expecting it to rise again. It didn't, but I had the hammer gripped tight, unwilling to let it go. The orchard ended at a low stone wall, beyond which was another expanse of open fields. The moonlight reflected off wet grass, and in the distance, I could see the faint glimmer of the estuary. It seemed impossibly far away. Dad boosted Mum's wheelchair over the wall first, then helped Ben scramble across before lifting the chair with her still in it, as though she weighed nothing. I climbed after them, landing awkwardly on the other side. We barely had time to catch our breath before a sound rose behind us, the moans of the infected from the woods. They were closer now, their voices blending together in a low, relentless wail that carried on the wind. We didn't have the orchard's cover anymore. Out here, in the open fields, we would be easy to spot. Dad took the front again, and I pushed Mum's wheelchair with Ben beside me. The ground was soft from recent rain, and the chair's small wheels sank into the mud, slowing us down. My arms burned from the effort, but I didn't dare stop. I could hear the moans growing louder behind us, and once, when I glanced over my shoulder, I saw flickers of movement near the tree line, shapes moving in the darkness. We angled toward the hedgerows that bordered the fields, hoping to stay out of sight. Dad led us into one of the narrow animal tracks cut through the brambles, the branches scraping at his jacket as he forced a way through. It was tight and winding, but at least it gave us some concealment. The chair jolted violently every time a wheel caught on a root, but Mum didn't complain, only gripped the arms tighter and looked straight ahead. It felt like we crawled forever through those hedgerows, emerging at last into another open stretch. This one was sloped and led down toward the estuary. I could smell the salt water more strongly now, mixed with the tang of mudflats exposed by the tide. Beyond the winding channels of black water, I could see the faint outlines of houses and fishing sheds near the harbor. "We're close," Dad said, barely more than a whisper. He was breathing hard, but he didn't slow. "Once we reach the water, we'll follow the shoreline. Stay low and quiet." I didn't need telling twice. The open field felt wrong, like we were walking across a stage with a spotlight on us. I kept my eyes moving, scanning for movement. Several times, I thought I saw it. Something crawling on the far ridge, a shadow against the hedgerow. But then it was gone. Halfway down the slope, Ben stumbled again. He was tired, dragging his feet, and when he tripped over a rut in the ground, he went down hard. I stopped immediately, reaching to help him up, but Dad was already there. He didn't scold, didn't waste time. He just hauled Ben to his feet and kept him moving. We reached the bottom of the slope and followed the sound of the tide until the marshy ground gave way to wet sand. The estuary stretched out in front of us, a labyrinth of shallow channels cutting through mudflats that glistened in the moonlight. Across the water, I could see the lights of the harbor, faint, flickering orange like firelight. Dad crouched and pointed to a line of reeds that ran along the edge of the channel. "We'll follow that. Stay in the shadows." The reeds offered some cover, but the ground was treacherous. My shoes sank into the mud with every step, and the wheels of Mum's chair stuck constantly, forcing me to yank them free. Each time we stopped, I felt exposed, like something was watching from the black water. Once, I thought I heard splashing somewhere upstream, a heavy slogging sound that didn't match the gentle lap of the tide. We kept moving, following the winding channel. Eventually, the reeds thinned, and we found ourselves on a narrow spit of firm ground that led toward the harbor. The structures there were clearer now, boats moored to creaking wooden piers, rows of sheds and small houses clustered along the shore. But something felt off. The air was thick with the scent of smoke, and I could see movement near the docks. At first, I thought it was survivors. People running, gesturing to each other, maybe loading boats. But as we crept closer, the truth became clearer. The shapes moved wrong. Their heads jerked, their bodies hunched unnaturally. One stumbled into the water and didn't try to climb out, just flailed uselessly as the tide carried it into a mooring post. The harbor was overrun. Dad knelt behind a collapsed section of fence and studied the scene. He didn't speak, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. We couldn't turn back. The infected were somewhere behind us in the fields, but the harbor ahead looked impossible to cross. Finally, he gestured for me to lean close. "We need a boat. There's no other way out of here. If we wait until dawn, we're dead. Do you understand?" I nodded. though the idea of walking into that mess of shadows and ruined bodies made my stomach churn. Dad's eyes moved over the moored vessels, assessing them like he was back on the docks at work. Most were too large for us to handle, or sitting too deep in the water, but then he pointed toward the far end of the pier, where a small motorboat bobbed in the tide. Its ropes were loose, swaying with each swell. "That one," he said. "If we're quick, we can take it before they notice." The plan was simple on paper. He would go first, clearing a path through the sheds to the pier, and we would follow with Mum. But nothing felt simple anymore. As we slipped through the broken fence and into the harbor's edge, every creak of the wooden boards felt like a shout. The infected moved between the sheds, some hunched and dragging themselves, others jerking with bursts of unnatural speed. Their skin was pale, blotched with patches of rot, and their mouths hung open as though their jaws had forgotten how to close. I tried not to look at their faces. We crept past the first shed, sticking to the shadows. One of the creatures shuffled past on the other side, so close I could smell the stench coming off it. I held my breath and pushed Mum's chair an inch at a time, terrified of the slightest noise. Ben was behind me, holding onto the duffel bag, like it was the only thing keeping him steady. Dad reached the pier first and turned back, gesturing sharply for us to hurry. We made it halfway down the boards when a loose plank gave way under one of the chair's wheels with a loud crack. The sound tore through the night like gunfire. The infected froze for a fraction of a second, their heads snapping toward us in unison. Then they moved. Some shambled forward with clumsy, dragging steps, while others bolted with a burst of unnatural speed, hands clawing at the air as though they could already feel our throats in their grip. Mum screamed. It was the first time she'd made a sound all night, a raw cry of terror that cut through the moans and the crash of boots on rotting boards. "Go! Leave me!" she shouted, her voice cracking with the effort. "Just go!" I looked at Dad, frozen in place. My hands were still on the wheelchair handles, my knuckles white. He didn't hesitate. He sprinted back to us, grabbed Mum under the arms, and hauled her from the chair in one fluid motion. She struggled, clawing at his shoulders, telling him to put her down, but he ignored her. He slung her over his shoulder as though she weighed nothing, and barked at me to grab Ben and be ready. I let go of the chair and grabbed my brother's arm, pulling him close. He stumbled as we ran, almost tripping over the uneven planks, but we didn't stop. The sound of the infected rushing the pier grew louder, their feet hammering the boards behind us, some falling into the water and thrashing like trapped animals, only to claw their way back onto the pier. Dad reached the small motorboat at the end of the pier and lowered Mum onto the deck. She was crying now, begging him to turn back, to go without her, but he only tightened the ropes holding the boat and shoved it closer to the pier. "James! Ben!" he barked, his voice low but urgent. We scrambled into the boat, landing hard on the wooden deck. I felt the hull rock dangerously with the sudden shift in weight and grabbed Ben's sleeve to keep him from toppling over. Dad swung himself in last, landing with a thud that almost sent us over the side. He shoved the boat off with a final kick, and it drifted away from the pier just as the first infected reached the end. The creatures didn't stop. They launched themselves into the water, their hands thrashing in the black waves as they swam clumsily toward us. Dad yanked the starter cord on the outboard motor, but it sputtered and died. He tried again, his teeth clenched, the infected closing in with every second. The motor coughed to life on the third pull. Dad jammed the throttle forward, and the boat surged away from the pier in a spray of cold salt water. One of the infected almost reached us, its hand grazing the stern before the engine carried us out of its reach. Mum was clutching Dad's arm now, no longer screaming, but muttering his name under her breath like a prayer. She tried to scold him, telling him he should have left her, but her voice was soft and trembling. Dad didn't answer. He stared straight ahead, steering us out of the harbor and into the open water, the wind pulling at his hair and jacket. The harbor lights receded behind us, the sounds of the infected growing faint and then vanishing altogether beneath the hum of the motor. I sat near the bow with Ben, staring out at the black expanse of the sea. The sky was cloudless now, and the stars reflected on the water like scattered glass. It should have been beautiful, but all I could think about was how empty it looked, how far we were from anything that might help us. After what felt like an hour, Dad cut the engine and let the boat drift. He didn't speak for a long time. The only sounds were the soft lapping of the waves and the distant call of seabirds. When Mum tried again to tell him he should have left her behind, he placed a hand on her shoulder and shook his head. His jaw was tight, and I realized he still hadn't looked at her since pulling her from the chair. Ben eventually broke the silence. He asked where we were going. Dad finally looked up, scanning the horizon until he spotted a faint outline against the dark sea. "There," he said quietly, pointing to what looked like a jagged shadow rising from the water. As the boat drifted closer, I could make out the shape of a small island, crowned by the silhouette of a castle perched on the highest point. I didn't know what to make of it. The place looked ancient, its stone walls rising high above the shoreline, but there were no lights, no sign of life. I wanted to ask if anyone was there, but I didn't. I didn't want the answer. The tide carried us closer until the rocky outline of the shore was clear. The island's cliffs were steep, but Dad guided the boat toward a narrow strip of beach at the base of the castle. The sand was coarse and dark, strewn with seaweed and driftwood. We pulled the boat ashore and sat in the sand for a moment, too tired to move. My arms and legs ached from the night's flight, and Ben was shaking with exhaustion beside me. Dad stood and helped Mum out of the boat, lifting her carefully. She rested her head against his shoulder and whispered something I couldn't hear. We made our way up the beach and found a narrow path that wound up the side of the cliff. It was steep and uneven, barely wide enough for Dad to carry Mum safely. I followed behind with Ben, clutching the hammer I still hadn't put down. Every rustle in the undergrowth made me glance over my shoulder, half expecting the infected to have followed us across the sea. The path eventually leveled out, leading us to a set of rusted iron gates set into the castle's outer wall. One was hanging open, its hinges creaking in the wind. Dad stepped through first, scanning the courtyard beyond, and motioned for us to follow. The castle grounds were overgrown and silent. Ivy crawled up the stone walls, and weeds sprouted through the cracks in the cobblestones. There was no sign of anyone living there. The windows of the main building were dark, their glass panes broken in places. We crossed the courtyard and stepped into the castle through a wide archway. The air inside was cold and stale, carrying the faint smell of mildew. Dad lowered Mum into an old wooden chair near the entrance and set about checking the rooms one by one, moving quietly with the hammer in his hand. I stayed with Mum and Ben, straining to hear any sound from deeper in the castle. After what felt like forever, Dad returned. He said the lower floors were empty, at least for now. There were signs of people having been there before. Old bedding, burnt-out candles, empty food tins, but nothing recent. We would need to find a secure room for the night, somewhere we could bar the door. We ended up in what looked like a former storage room at the back of the castle. The walls were solid stone, and the door was thick and sturdy. Dad wedged a rusted metal bar across it before we lay down on the cold floor. No one spoke much. Ben curled up beside me, and Mum rested against Dad, whispering that he shouldn't have risked everything for her. She tried to laugh as she said it, tried to scold him lovingly for being too stubborn, but he didn't respond. He only stared at the stone wall in front of him, his expression distant. I closed my eyes and tried to convince myself that we were safe for the night, but I couldn't stop thinking about the infected in the harbor, the ones that had hurled themselves into the water without hesitation. I wondered how far they could swim. When I woke, there was a pale blue light leaking in through a crack in the shutters. Early morning. The air was damp and cold inside the storage room. The smell of mildew stronger now that the room had warmed slightly from our breath overnight. Ben was curled up against my side, still asleep, his face slack with exhaustion. Mum was a few feet away, lying on a blanket Dad must have spread out for her. Her head rested awkwardly against the wall, one arm drawn across her chest as if she'd tried to keep warm. I sat up slowly, careful not to wake either of them, and looked around the room. The door was still shut, the rusted iron bar wedged across it from the night before. But something felt off. The heavy table we had dragged across the doorway on the outside when we barricaded ourselves in had been moved. I could see just enough through the gap at the bottom of the door to realize the table wasn't pressed tight against the frame anymore. My first thought was Dad. He wasn't lying beside Mum like he had been when I drifted off. I whispered his name at first, quietly, in case he had simply moved to another corner of the room. When there was no answer, I whispered louder. Still nothing. I got up and went to the door. The iron bar was awkward to lift, my hand stiff from the cold, but I managed to slide it free without making too much noise. Beyond the door, I could see the legs of the table wedged at an angle across the frame. Someone had pushed it aside just enough to squeeze through. I set my shoulder against the table and pushed. It scraped across the stone floor with a noise that made me wince, but there was no way to move it quietly. I worked it just far enough to slip out, then eased it back into place behind me so Mum and Ben would still have some protection. The castle's corridor was dim and smelled of dust. A faint draft moved through the broken windows at the far end, carrying the distant sound of gulls. I moved quietly, listening for Dad, but the only sound was the echo of my own footsteps. I checked the nearby rooms first, but they were all empty, each one stripped bare except for broken furniture and piles of rubble. Finally, I heard voices coming from the great hall. They were low at first, indistinct, but as I drew closer they became louder, sharper. Someone was arguing. I stepped into the archway of the hall and froze. Dad was standing near the center of the room with 3 strangers. One was a man around Dad's age, tall and wiry, his clothes soaked with seawater and torn in places. The second was a woman in her 20s, her dark hair matted with salt and grime, a kitchen knife clenched in her hand. The third was a boy who looked barely older than Ben, standing slightly behind the others and clutching a length of pipe. The older man was shouting at Dad, his voice echoing off the stone walls. He wanted us to leave, or so I gathered from the few words I caught. He kept pointing toward the door, his gestures sharp and angry. Dad was squared up to him, arms folded, his stance like a rock in a storm. When they noticed me standing there, the argument stopped instantly. All 3 strangers turned their eyes on me, and the look in them made my stomach tighten. The woman raised her knife slightly, like she thought I might be a threat. The boy shifted his grip on the pipe. Dad stepped between me and the others before anyone could say anything. His hand came up firm but protective, and he told me to stay where I was. He didn't raise his voice, but there was steel in his tone. The tall man sneered and muttered something I couldn't catch. He jabbed a finger toward me, then toward the door again. Dad's jaw tightened. He told the man to stop, his voice low and calm, but the kind of calm that could break at any second. The woman stepped forward, knife still in hand, and said we should go before we brought more infected to the island. Dad turned his head slowly toward her, and for a moment I thought he might actually lash out. Instead, he told her that we had as much right to be here as anyone else, that this wasn't her castle, wasn't the man's castle, wasn't anyone's. The tall man took a step forward like he was about to test him. Dad didn't move. He just stood his ground, broad shoulders squared, the same way I had seen him face storms at sea. The silence that followed was heavy and brittle, and I could feel the tension thrumming in the room like a wire stretched too tight. Eventually, the man backed down with a curse under his breath. He spat on the floor and told Dad to stay out of their way. The woman lowered her knife a fraction but kept her eyes on me like she was waiting for me to do something wrong. The boy didn't look at me at all. Dad came over and put a hand on my shoulder, guiding me back toward the archway. He didn't say anything until we were in the corridor again, out of sight of the others. Then he told me there were more people on the island than he'd expected, and that most of them were just as scared and desperate as we were. I asked if they were going to let us stay. He didn't answer right away, and that silence was enough to make me worry. We returned to the storage room, and I helped him move the table out of the way. Mum was awake now, propped against the wall, and Ben had stirred too. They both looked at us expectantly, and Dad sat down heavily on the floor before explaining. He told us there were others in the castle. He'd gone out before dawn and found them camped in one of the upper chambers. They'd arrived on the island just like we had, fleeing the mainland, and they didn't want to share what little they had. He admitted there had been shouting and that things had almost turned violent when he refused to leave. Mum listened quietly and then told him she was proud of him for bringing us this far. She said we would figure out a way to survive, like we always had. Dad didn't respond. He just rubbed a hand across his face, the lines around his eyes deepening. We spent the rest of the morning in that cramped room, speaking in low voices. Every so often, I thought I heard footsteps in the corridor outside, but no one came to the door. We ate a little of the food from Dad's bag, though none of us had much appetite, and waited to see what the others would do. By midday, Dad decided we couldn't stay locked away forever. He said we needed to explore the castle more thoroughly, find a better position, maybe even see if we could get the others to cooperate. We moved carefully through the stone halls, sticking close together, and kept our voices low. The castle was bigger than I'd realized, its corridors twisting and branching in ways that made it easy to get lost. Some rooms looked like they hadn't been used in decades. Dust-covered furniture, crumbling tapestries, piles of rubble where parts of the ceiling had collapsed. Others had clear signs of recent use, fire pits in the middle of stone floors, makeshift bedding laid out in corners. We avoided the great hall where Dad had argued with the strangers earlier. He didn't want another confrontation. Instead, we climbed a narrow spiral staircase that led to one of the towers. From the top, we could see the entire island, a small patch of rock and grass surrounded by endless sea. The beach where we had landed was visible far below, and beyond it, the dark line of the mainland. I thought of the infected in the harbor again. I asked Dad if he thought they could swim this far. He didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. He said he didn't know, but we had to assume it was possible. We returned to the storage room as the light began to fade. The air in the castle felt heavier now, as though the stone walls themselves were holding their breath. We locked ourselves in again, dragging the table back across the door, and sat together in the cold. I could hear the other group moving somewhere upstairs. Their voices carried faintly through the walls, but I couldn't make out the words. I wondered if they were planning to drive us out during the night. Dad didn't seem worried, but I noticed how he kept the hammer close to hand. Mum asked if he thought we could trust the others. He said he didn't trust anyone anymore. As darkness settled over the island, the castle seemed to grow colder. I lay awake, listening to the wind howl through the broken windows, and wondering how long this place could keep us safe. The noises outside felt louder in the night, the waves slapping against the rocks far below, the occasional cry of seabirds startled from their nests, the groan of the castle's old timbers shifting with the gusts. I tried to picture the mainland, the village we'd left behind, but all I could see in my head were the faces of the infected as they threw themselves into the water at the harbor. I didn't sleep much. The next morning was bright but sharp with the chill of sea air. Dad had been up before the rest of us, moving quietly through the castle corridors with that deliberate pace of his. When he came back to the room, his expression told me enough. Something was wrong. He didn't say much, just told me to get my coat and follow him. Mum looked uneasy, but she didn't protest. She only told me to be careful as I helped move the table from the door so we could leave. Ben sat in the corner, wide-eyed and silent, watching us go. We met the tall man from the other group in the courtyard. He looked different in the daylight. Less angry, more focused, like he understood the same thing Dad did. Whatever was outside the castle was more dangerous than anything inside. He jerked his chin toward the path that wound down to the shore and said he'd spotted something among the rocks when the tide went out. He'd come to check, with or without us. The three of us walked in silence down the path, boots crunching over the gravel and loose stones. The sea was calm, but the air carried a low hum that made me think of storms far out beyond the horizon. When we reached the beach, I saw them. At first, they looked like bundles of seaweed caught on the jagged rocks, washed in by the tide. But then, one of them twitched. There were 3 infected in total, their clothes in tatters, their bodies pale and bloated from the water. They were tangled in the kelp and flotsam at the edge of the tide line, motionless until we stepped closer. Then their heads jerked up, and I realized they hadn't been dead after all. I froze, unsure how close I could risk getting, but Dad didn't. He raised the hammer and stepped forward, keeping his weight low and his eyes on their hands in case they tried to lunge. The tall man moved with him, carrying a length of steel pipe he must have scavenged from the castle. One of the creatures made a rasping noise, its limbs twitching violently as it tried to crawl toward us through the tangle of weed. We were close enough now that I could see the mottled patches of rot on their faces, the way their lips had pulled back from their teeth in death. My grip tightened on the hammer Dad had let me carry. I was focused on the three of them ahead of us, so focused that I didn't notice the lump of seaweed to my right shift until it was too late. Something exploded upward from the pile, throwing kelp and sand into the air. One of the infected must have been buried beneath it, hidden from view until I got close enough to trigger it. Its body slammed into me with such force that I staggered backward, my boots slipping on the wet rocks. My arms pinwheeled as I tried to keep my balance, but it was already on me, its breath foul with rot, its teeth snapping at my face. I brought the hammer up but was too slow, too off balance. The infected was faster than I expected. Its hands clawed at my jacket, and I could see the glint of its teeth inches from my cheek. Then there was a sharp crack, and the creature went limp. The tall man stood over me, his steel pipe slick with blood and seawater. He'd struck the infected with a practiced swing, caving in the base of its skull so cleanly that it hadn't even made a sound before collapsing. He held out a hand and pulled me to my feet as Dad arrived, hammer raised, his face tight with fury at how close I'd come. I muttered a thank you, my voice unsteady. Dad spoke louder, looking the tall man directly in the eye. "You saved my son," he said simply. There was no hesitation, no grudging tone, just those 4 words. The man nodded, and for a moment something shifted between them. The hostility I'd seen in the castle the day before was gone, replaced by a kind of mutual understanding. They were both fathers. They both knew what it meant to lose someone. We finished the work on the beach together. The other 3 infected tried to lurch forward as we approached, their bloated limbs thrashing against the seaweed. Dad dealt with one cleanly, the hammer driving down into its temple, while the tall man dispatched the second with another blow from his pipe. The last one was smaller, probably a teenager before the infection, and for a second I couldn't move. Then I stepped forward and brought the hammer down myself. It didn't feel like victory. When it was done, we dragged the bodies further out along the rocks and pushed them into the water, letting the current take them. I watched them drift until they vanished beneath the waves, wondering how many more might be out there, just below the surface, waiting for the tide to bring them ashore. Back at the castle, Mum and Ben were waiting us when we returned. Mum's face went pale when she saw the blood on my jacket, and she asked what had happened. I told her it was nothing, but Dad didn't let me hide it. He explained what we'd found on the beach, his voice steady and practical. There was no reason to sugarcoat the truth anymore. The news unsettled everyone. Even the woman from the other group, who had kept her distance from us until now, looked shaken when she heard that the infected were washing up on the island. She asked how many more we thought would come. Dad told her we didn't know, but that we would need to secure the castle better if we wanted to survive. That afternoon, the mood changed. The fear of the infected on the shore forced the 2 groups to work together for the first time. We set about reinforcing the outer gates, dragging heavy furniture and debris from the courtyard to block the entrances. The woman and I scavenged the upper floors for anything useful. Old tools, scraps of wood, even lengths of chain we could use as locks. She wasn't as unfriendly as before. She worked quickly and spoke little, but when we did talk, it was about practical things. How long the food might last, whether the castle's wells were still drinkable, how we'd defend the place if more infected arrived. By evening, we had made some progress. The gates were more secure, the doors barred from the inside. We'd even managed to clear one of the towers enough to use it as a watchpost. The boy from the other group volunteered to take the first shift. He was quiet but capable, and I saw Dad give him a nod of respect as he climbed the stairs. We gathered in the great hall as the light faded, the 2 groups finally sharing the same fire. There was still tension in the air, but it was muted now, softened by the unspoken understanding that none of us could survive alone. Dad spoke to the tall man a few times, exchanging short sentences about the island and the boats moored at the shore. I caught him glance at me once, and I thought I saw something like relief in his expression. Later, when we returned to the storage room, Mum asked quietly if things were going to get better now. Dad didn't answer right away. He just knelt beside her, adjusted the blanket around her shoulders, and said we'd done what we could for now. Dad also added that our neighbors are called Clark, Little Tom, and Rose. I lay awake again that night, staring at the cracked ceiling. The island was supposed to be safe, a sanctuary away from the mainland and the infected that had torn through our village. But now I wasn't so sure. The tide had carried the dead to our shore once. It could do it again. When dawn came, I pushed myself up slowly, trying not to wake Ben, who was still curled against the wall. Mum was already awake, her hands resting in her lap, a tired smile on her face when she saw me stir. She didn't ask for help immediately like she used to. That morning, Rose appeared in the doorway with a wide grin and something clattering in front of her. An old rusted wheelchair she had found in one of the castle's forgotten chambers. "It's not much," she said, pushing it toward us, "but it's better than being stuck on the floor or having someone carry you everywhere." The chair's wheels squealed against the stone floor, and one of them stuck a little when it hit debris, but Mum's face lit up all the same. With Dad and me lifting her carefully into it, she settled down with a relieved sigh. It didn't work perfectly, but it gave her some independence, something she hadn't had since we fled home. Rose crouched down to adjust one of the footrests and muttered that she'd oil the axles later. Clark appeared in the corridor behind her. He didn't say much, just asked if Dad was up. He'd become less combative after saving me on the shore the day before, but his presence still carried a weight of authority. Dad came forward from the adjoining room, greeting him with a curt nod. There wasn't much warmth between them, but the mutual respect was clear. Clark told us there was something we needed to see. We followed him up the narrow steps to one of the castle's towers, where little Tom sat with his legs swinging idly from the parapet. He was young, maybe 12, but he'd volunteered for the watch that morning, determined to pull his weight. He pointed out toward the horizon. At first, I couldn't see it. Then the morning mist shifted, and there it was, a large boat making its way toward the island. It wasn't like our small motorboat. This one had a cabin and enough deck space for several people. Even from a distance, I could see the shapes of men and women standing on it, scanning the shoreline with wary eyes. Dad and Clark exchanged a look. Rose asked if we should hide, but Dad shook his head. If they made it here, it means they've got fuel and food. Supplies, he said. If they want to stay, they need to share. We can't afford to let anyone think they can come here and take whatever they want. By the time the boat pulled up at the small strip of beach below the castle, Dad and Clark were already waiting for them. The rest of us stayed back in the courtyard, watching from behind the safety of the walls. Mum insisted on being there too, and Rose pushed her wheelchair into position, locking the wheels so it wouldn't roll on the uneven stones. The group that stepped off the boat looked rough, but not hostile. There were 5 of them, 3 men, 2 women, dressed in heavy coats and boots that looked like they'd come straight from the mainland's freezing docks. They carried crates and bags onto the sand, clearly well stocked, and one of the men, broad-shouldered and carrying himself like he was used to giving orders, stepped forward to greet Dad and Clark. I couldn't hear the conversation from where we were, but I could see the way Dad stood, straight-backed, feet planted, calm but firm. Clark was the same, his arms crossed loosely over his chest. The man on the beach gestured toward the castle several times, and I saw Dad shake his head slowly. At one point, Clark raised a hand and pointed to the crates of supplies the group had brought. Later, Dad told us exactly what was said. He and Clark had made it clear. If the new arrivals wanted to stay on the island, they would need to share their supplies with everyone already here. In return, the castle's defenses would be open to them, and we would work together, at least temporarily, to survive. The man had balked at first. I could tell from the way his hands spread wide, his face set in a grimace. But eventually, he relented. It wasn't because he trusted Dad or Clark. It was because he could see the castle was the safest place for miles, and the mainland was a death sentence. They brought their crates up the winding path and into the courtyard. There was more food in those boxes than we'd seen since the outbreak. Tins of fish and beans, sacks of flour, bottled water, even a few crates of dried fruit. One of the women carried a sealed medical kit that made Rose's eyes light up. Antiseptics, bandages, and syringes all intact. I watched Mum as the supplies were stacked along the castle walls. She didn't look relieved. She looked wary. She knew the same thing I did. More people meant more mouths to feed, more tensions, more danger if trust started to fracture. That evening, we all gathered in the great hall. There were 15 of us now, the firelight throwing long shadows across the stone walls. Dad and Clark stood together at the front, laying out the rules they'd agreed upon. All supplies would be shared and stored in one location. Guard shifts would be rotated through day and night, and any decisions that affected the group would be made together. The new arrivals agreed, though I could see the reluctance in their faces. One of the men kept glancing at his crates like he was afraid we'd take them. When his back was turned, Rose noticed it too, and muttered to me that we'd need to keep an eye on him. Later, when most of the group had drifted off to their corners of the castle, I found Dad and Clark talking quietly near the watchtower stairs. Clark was leaning against the wall, his arms loose at his sides, the lines on his face deeper in the firelight. Dad stood beside him, staring out into the dark through a crack in the stone. "They'll stay as long as they think this place can protect them," Dad said. Clark nodded slowly. "And if it can't?" "Then we'll be back to where we started," Dad replied. "But for now, we keep this place secure. We can't afford mistakes." That night, I walked the upper walls with little Tom, who had insisted on taking another shift on watch. He was small, but sharp-eyed, pointing out every shadow that looked suspicious, every distant shape on the water. We spoke quietly about the castle, about the supplies, about how strange it felt to suddenly have so many people around after the silence of the first days. The wind was cold off the sea, carrying the salt and dampness of the tide. I leaned against the rough stone of the parapet, scanning the black horizon, but the boy was right. It did feel strange. There had been comfort in those first silent days on the island, even with the fear of the infected washing ashore. Now the place felt louder, full of voices and movement. 15 of us meant 15 chances for mistakes. Tom was the one who spotted it first. He tugged at my sleeve and pointed out to sea. I followed his finger and saw a faint shape bobbing on the waves. Then another. At first, I thought they were driftwood, but as the moon broke through the clouds, I saw arms, faces, bodies moving with slow, purposeful motions toward the island. I didn't shout. I told Tom to run and wake Dad, Clark, anyone he could find. Then I reached for the heavy bell we'd hung in the tower for emergencies. The deep clang rang out across the island, reverberating through the castle walls. It was enough to wake everyone. By the time Dad and Clark reached the wall, there were dozens of them in the water, their heads just visible above the waves. They didn't thrash or flail like the drowned ones we'd seen before. These moved with grim determination, pulled by the current but crawling forward as if they could sense where we were. "Gates locked?" Clark asked, his voice flat. "Everyone," Dad said. He glanced at me and nodded. "Get your brother and your mum somewhere safe." I wanted to argue, but I knew he was right. I found Mum in the courtyard, Rose beside her, pushing her chair toward the storage room we'd been using. Ben was already there, carrying blankets and water. Mum's face was pale, her hands gripping the arms of the chair hard enough that her knuckles showed white. She asked how many there were. I told her too many. Back outside, the infected had reached the shore. They crawled up over the wet rocks, dragging themselves through seaweed and sand, their bodies slick with salt water. The sound of them was worse than anything I'd heard before. The scrape of bone and nail on stone, the low guttural moans rising into the night air. The first group reached the outer walls, clawing at the gates, throwing their weight against the barricades. We had reinforced them, but the gates shuddered with every impact. Dad and Clark organized the others quickly. Those with weapons manned the walls, while the rest dragged more debris into place behind the gates. I stood on the parapet with Tom and Rose, gripping my hammer and trying to steady my breath. When the gates finally gave way, it wasn't because they were weak. it was because there were simply too many. The infected surged through the breach like a tide, their pale faces catching the torchlight. I swung the hammer at the first one that reached the steps, the impact sending it toppling backward into the crowd behind it. The fight inside the walls was chaos. Screams mixed with the guttural sounds of the infected, the clash of improvised weapons against skulls and limbs. I stayed near the stairs, helping to hold the line as Dad and Clark drove the rest of us back toward the inner courtyard. The new arrivals fought as hard as anyone. One of the women, the one with the medical kit, stabbed at the infected with a sharpened pole. We made it to the keep, dragging what we could across the doorways to block the entrance. Clark was bleeding from a gash in his arm, but he didn't slow. He stood shoulder to shoulder with Dad, giving orders as the barricades went up. "We'll hold this hall," he said. "If we lose it, we pull everyone upstairs and use the towers." The infected slammed into the doors minutes later. The barricades creaked and shifted but held, for now. We formed a line behind them, weapons ready, knowing that the wood wouldn't last forever. Rose handed me a kitchen knife, her hand trembling but her face hard with determination. The hours blurred together after that. We took turns at the doors, striking at the hands and faces that pushed through the gaps, forcing the bodies back as best we could. Clark's boy Tom stood near me, smaller than the rest but just as resolute, calling out warnings when the barricades shifted too far. At one point, I saw Dad stagger. He'd taken a blow to the shoulder, and I ran to steady him. He gave me a tired smile and told me we were doing fine. I didn't believe him, but I nodded anyway. By the time the sky began to lighten, the sounds at the doors had changed. They were weaker now, more sporadic. Some of the infected had been crushed beneath the weight of their own numbers. Others had simply wandered back out the way they'd come, drawn away by the sea. We opened the doors cautiously, stepping out into a courtyard littered with bodies. The air stank of salt and decay. There were fewer of us standing now, but we were still standing. Clark leaned heavily on his pipe, his face grey with exhaustion, and Dad rested a hand on his shoulder. "No one else comes in without all of us agreeing," Clark said quietly. Dad nodded. We spent the rest of the day clearing the bodies from the courtyard and dragging them down to the shore. The tide would take them, just like the others, but it felt hollow to watch them float away. We knew more would come eventually. That night we sat in the great hall again. The fire burned low, and the faces around it were lined with exhaustion. Mum sat in her chair near the flames, Ben and Tom dozing against her legs. Rose leaned back against the wall, eyes closed, her knife still at her side. Dad stood slowly, glancing around the room. "We survived," he said. His voice was rough but steady. "We're going to keep surviving. As long as we work together, as long as we don't give up, we can make this place hold." Clark nodded, his eyes meeting Dad's across the room. The new arrivals gave murmurs of agreement. It wasn't hope exactly, but it was something close. Later, as the others drifted off to whatever corners of the castle they had claimed, I climbed the stairs to the watchtower. The sea was calm again, the stars clear and sharp overhead. But I didn't look out at the horizon. I looked down at the island itself, the dark walls of the castle, the courtyard we'd fought so hard to hold. It didn't feel safe. Not really, but it felt like we had a chance. And for now, that was enough. That's all for now. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more unsettling creepypastas. Your support keeps my channel alive. Until next time, stay quiet, stay vigilant, and trust nothing, not even the silence.